Why, hello YouTube, greetings from a lazy eyebrow to a short video of a project I've been working on in the meantime. I feature them a few times in videos, but for those unaware, I've been collecting a series of 187 scale vehicles based on the alt modes of G1 characters. The collection currently consists of the Stunticons as sent in from Robert Dane, Optimus, Sideswipe, Sunstreaker, Bumblebee, Jazz, Cliffjumper, a really wrong model of Huffer, and a certain few others that I'll be covering real soon. However, considering the project was intended as complements to my train set, which is also 187 from here on out referred to as HO scale, I figured what better addition could there be other than a figure that actually turns into a locomotive when he's not hauling the whole Decepticon army through space. Astrotrain. So this project started as a Blender model. Originally, I was planning on just printing the whole thing and having a static model, but I needed to start somewhere, so I gathered as many pictures as I could of the JNR D51, as well as a free model of the locomotive itself, so I could scale it and get reference sizes to design mine with the printer in mind. This began with the boiler, then the surrounding detail of the boiler, moved on to the cab, and by the time I got to designing the thrusters, it occurred to me that I could use an existing chassis from a 484 locomotive I had, and then turn my model into a shell that I could paint and then apply to said chassis. I mean, I would have gladly hunted down an existing model and customized that, but no model in HO scale exists. Which I found really weird considering Bachmann makes a lot of the Thomas the Tank Engine models, but I've never once made a hero, which would have been exactly what I would have needed for this project. But more on this point later. Anyway, given that what I had was the wrong configuration as the D51 is a 282, not a 484, there was also an additional plan to make the correct leading and trailing wheels, but this would be a problem I would try and solve later. Anyway, I modeled a basic chassis in Blender to get dimensions to hollow out the boiler and segmented it to fit within my printer as the Photon has a really small print area, and then I began printing. Well, it didn't turn out. I just got into resin printing and my settings were all out of whack as well as my placement and all that nonsense. I tried printing the cab a few times and after the third time I finally got that right, and then I printed the middle of the boiler. At that point I had 3 prints of various success rates that I could at least sort of cobble together to get a sense of scale and how big it would be and yeah, that's a bit big. As it turns out, this ended up being more 176 instead of 187, and I don't collect 00 scale, I do HO. Regardless, I had a semi-coherent model on top of 8 drive wheels. It would be a crime not to test it at this point. And I gotta say, seeing it in action is kinda special. It's a powered Astrotrain, the first I've seen anyway. Features of this design include me printing the front in clear so that when done I can route an LED into the front headlamp. I added 5mm ports into the thrusters so I could add blast effects as it rumbles down the track. So basically this is as far as we got into the HO scale Astrotrain Mark 1. So the question remains, where do I go from here? Well, I started scouring the internet and eventually came across an older 282 Mikado locomotive on eBay made from Lima from the 80s. This model has its connecting rod attached to the third driving axle instead of the second, which is great because that's more accurate than the D51. The driving and trailing wheels are accurate, which means less design work on my end, and this model also uses much smaller drive wheels, which makes the notion of making a more proportionate locomotive much easier to attain HO scale. Which, around this time I discovered isn't technically possible. Turns out the Japanese railways used Cape gauge rails. These rails are 3 foot 6 inches wide, where standard gauge is 4 foot 8.5 inches. No such gauge rails exist in HO. For those about to say it sounds like N scale might be what I'm looking for, no, and here's why. Cape gauge is 25% narrower than standard gauge rails, N scale is 40% smaller than HO scale. In other words, if I went to N, that would be too small. Interestingly enough, after doing some measuring, turns out G1 Astrotrain's locomotive works out to be a proper 187 scale, which means this picture's in scale. Fancy that. Anyway, this explains why I'm having the worst time finding an existing HO scale D51. It's because it doesn't exist. And bear with me, I'm about to get real nerdy about a kid's show. This leaves the question about why Hero exists in Thomas the Tank Engine, and why he didn't show up in the narrow gauge. Like with Skarloey and Rheneas, Peter Sam, and all that crew. Well, it turns out they scaled Hero up for the sake of the show so we could interact with Thomas and Henry and company. Does this surprise me? No, not really. This show really tanked when Mattel took over, so aside from a few good episodes written here and there apparently by Andrew Brenner, what's continuity and scale, am I right? So all that aside, the question remains, what am I going to do? The whole point of the project was an HO scale locomotive to showcase the differences in scale, and it turns out no matter what I do, the scale is going to be wrong because the rails it runs on are wrong. I think I'm still going to pursue it though. One, because in the show, Astrotrain ran on standard gauge. So here's my in-universe headcanon, if you will. He came to Earth, landed in Japan, scanned a random locomotive, and scaled himself up to fit on American rails. I mean, obviously scale is a concept that flies out the window anyway with Astrotrain, so what difference does it make? Two, because having a rocket-powered space choo-choo that actually functions is just cool unto itself. And three, because I already modeled the dang thing and it's ready to be printed, and the new donor chassis arrived yesterday, and it would be a crime at this point not to do anything with it. In fact, I've already begun painting the tender. So this has been my quick little update video about a project I'm working on that turned into a video a little longer than I was expecting. I hope you like what you've seen so far, and I cannot wait to show you the final result. This has been the Lazy Eyebrow.